At the time, one of them needed the deal just to survive. The other did not know yet that one day it would too. For decades, the world of personal computing spoke only one language, one instruction set, one blueprint, x86. The giants still control its destiny. Intel and AMD, rivals, competitors, legal enemies for nearly half a century. But back in 1982, in the heart of Silicon Valley, these two companies signed a contract that accidentally created the most important duopoly in the history of technology. Before there was Intel, before there was AMD, there was Fairchild Semiconductor. In the 1960s, Fairchild was the center of the universe for chip engineers. The best minds in the industry worked under one roof, and two of them would go on to define the next 60 years of computing. Robert Noyce and Gordon Moore left Fairchild in 1968 and founded Intel. They commercialized the first widely adopted microprocessor and helped to define what modern computing would look like. They were building the future. A year later, a brash, Hollywood-dressed sales director named Jerry Sanders was fired from Fairchild. 8 engineers walked out with him. They founded AMD. Same training, same school, same era. Different visions. Intel wanted to build the chips that defined computing. AMD wanted to build the chips Intel could not build fast enough. For the next 7 years, they operated in parallel. Not enemies, not partners, just neighbors in the same industry. Then, IBM made a phone call. 1981. IBM is building a personal computer. They choose Intel's 8086 processor as the brain of the machine. It's a massive contract, the kind that could define a company's trajectory for a decade. But IBM has one condition: Intel must provide a second source manufacturer. IBM's procurement team had a rule: if your product is critical to our supply chain, we need a backup. A second company that can manufacture compatible chips to the same spec on short notice. Intel could not argue. IBM's PC contract was too valuable. So Intel looked across Silicon Valley at the company Jerry Sanders had built from 8 engineers and a fired sales director and made an offer. In October 1981, they announced the deal. In February 1982, they signed it. IBM required supply redundancy, and Intel chose AMD as its second source partner. AMD would be licensed to produce compatible versions of Intel's processors. Intel will get IBM. Both companies will get the x86 standard. It looked like a partnership. It was actually a time bomb. By 1984, everything had changed. The IBM PC had not just succeeded, it had exploded. An entire ecosystem of clone manufacturers had emerged: Compaq, HP, Dell. Hundreds of companies building machines around Intel's x86 architecture. Intel realized something: they did not need IBM anymore. And if they did not need IBM, they did not need AMD. Intel's new CEO in the Grove was not Bob Noyce. Noyce was a founder, a visionary, a man who shook hands and meant it. Grove was a survivor, a Hungarian refugee who had escaped communist occupation and built himself into one of the hardest executives in Silicon Valley. He did not believe in handshakes, he believed in dominance. In 1984, Intel began restricting access to the technical updates required under the agreement. The mechanism by which AMD would earn access to the next generation of processors. No 386 blueprints, no technical documentation, nothing. They did not announce it, they just stopped. AMD waited, sent inquiries, got vague response. By 1986, They understood what had happened. Intel had used a contract to keep AMD in their orbit, away from competitors like NEC and Fujitsu, and then pulled the ladder up behind them. J.R. Sanders had trust the signed contract. Andy Grove had decided it was no longer worth honoring. In April 1987, AMD filed for arbitration. What followed was one of the longest and most expensive legal battles in Silicon Valley history. 355 days of hearings, 7 years in courts and arbitration. Intel threw every legal weapon they had: copyright claims, patent suits, injunctions. In 1992, the arbitrator ruled Intel had not fully complied with the agreement, and the evidence suggests the restriction had been deliberate, not accidental. Intel appealed, it went to the California Court of Appeals, then to the California Supreme Court. In 1994, AMD won. AMD had won the battle, but Intel had won the war. While AMD spent 7 years in courtrooms, Intel had shipped 386, then 486, then the Pentium. The PC market had grown from 55% of computers in 1986 to 84% by 1990, entirely on Intel architecture, entirely without AMD competition. Intel had bought themselves a decade of dominance with a contract breach and a legal strategy that cost $100 million in legal fees. They returned billions in uncontested market share. But AMD had not died. They had learned something in those 7 years that Intel had not expected: how to build from scratch. With the 386 license secured, AMD went further. They stopped being a second source manufacturer and started being an innovator. In 1999 they released the Athlon, the first x86 processor designed entirely in-house from the ground up with no Intel blueprints. In 2000, AMD broke the 1 GHz barrier before Intel. By 2003, AMD's Athlon 64 was often outperforming Intel's flagship Pentium 4 in real-world tests. Enthusiasts who had never considered AMD were switching. And then AMD did something Intel had never anticipated. They invented x86-64, the 64-bit extension of the x86 architecture that every modern processor now runs on.
3 minutes, Dr. Ruiz.
One last question. Where did the idea for creating a breakout performance product come from?
Well, that is quite a story.
Intel had no choice but to adopt it. The company that had tried to freeze AMD out of the future was now licensing architecture from them. Jerry Sanders, the man Intel had tried to bury in courtrooms, watched AMD reshape the very standard Intel thought they owned. Fast forward to today, the chip wars have changed shape entirely. The battleground is no longer consumer processors, it's artificial intelligence, data centers, GPU clusters, training models that will run the next decade of technology. Intel did not just miss a trend, they got trapped in their own legacy. While they spent years fighting internal manufacturing delays, the map of the computing world has been redrawn. The AI revolution did not care about CPU dominance, it wanted raw GPU power, a field where Intel was nowhere to be found. AMD, the company that once had to beg for the right to exist, saw the opening. By leveraging TSMC's cutting-edge nodes and pivoting faster than the giant ever could, they have turned the MI300 into the first real piece of hardware that makes Nvidia look over its shoulder. Intel, the king of the PC era, is now making the ultimate gamble, spending billions to build the world's foundries, hoping that even if they don't win the AI race, they can at least own the finish line. Here is what this story actually is. In 1982, Intel needed AMD to satisfy IBM's condition. They handed over their blueprint because they had no choice. in 1984, they decided the deal was no longer worth keeping. They walked away from it. They spent 7 years trying to undo what a signed contract had created. They failed. AMD survived because of one contract clause, one moment in 1994 when a court ruled that a deal is a deal and Intel had broken it. Every Ryzen chip, every EPYC server, and every MI300 GPU fighting for AI supremacy today exists because of that single legal victory. But as the AI revolution accelerates, the roles have reversed. Intel, the titan that built the PC era, now finds itself in a fight for its life, struggling to catch up in a market it was supposed to own. The final twist, the 64-bit architecture that powers almost every modern PC, was not created by Intel, it was invented by AMD. To keep the industry standard alive, both giants had entered a cross-licensing pact, an uneasy peace that remains the bedrock of computing to this day. The company they tried to bury ended up owning a vital piece of the blueprint. This is the hidden history of technology, where a contract from 1982 is still shaping the AI revolution 40 years later.